On February 20th, 2026, the basic rules of American economic power underwent a fundamental change. In a 6 to 3 decision, the Supreme Court took away the president's most flexible tool for controlling global trade by ruling that a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, does not give the president the right to start tariffs on his own. The court ended a year long strategy of using national emergencies to reshape trade rules. This is not just a small legal fight, it is a major shift in how the United States uses its money and influence around the world. For the past year, the world has watched as the White House used emergency powers to bypass the slow traditional methods of setting trade policy. That era, often called the era of unilateral trade, has now been stopped with the highest court in the land. Welcome to Elephanta Insights. Today, we are looking at the results of the court case Learning Resources, Incorporated versus Trump. Throughout 2025, the government used emergency rules to put a 10% tax on almost all goods coming into the country. This allowed them to skip the usual long process in Congress, where laws are debated and voted on. That period of the president acting alone has now been stopped by the law. The Supreme Court has made it clear that the power to tax and control trade belongs strictly to Congress, the people who make the laws. This ruling brings back the system of checks and balances that had been pushed aside in the name of national security and economic crisis. This decision has forced the government to quickly change its plans and started what we now call the 150-day clock. Today, we will explain how the power over trade is moving back to Congress and what this means for the global economy. To understand why this is such a big deal, we have to look at the tool the president can no longer use. All through 2025, the government used the IEEPA law because it was fast. Usually, trade laws require months of research, public hearings, and proof of harm to American companies. But IEEPA allowed the president to act immediately just by saying there was a national emergency. In this case, the administration had linked these emergency tariffs to issues like the fentanyl crisis and the national trade deficit. This turned a law originally meant for stopping bad actors, like terrorists or hostile regimes, into a way to tax almost everything coming into the US. The court used a rule called the Major Questions Doctrine. This rule says that if the president wants to make a choice that has a huge impact on the economy or politics, he must have very clear permission from Congress. The court decided that a global tax is too big of a deal to be based on a loose interpretation of an emergency law written decades ago. The judges explained that since tariffs are basically taxes, they fall under the power of Congress to raise money. This means the president cannot use an emergency as an excuse to change the country's tax system on his own. While other trade laws are still there, the shortcut is gone. This forces the government to stop using sudden, broad changes and instead follow a much slower process based on clear evidence. By taking this power away, the court didn't just stop one leader, it put limits on the office of the president itself. Any future plan to change the American economy will now need more than just a signature. It will need many people in the legislative branch to agree. This brings us to a critical point about the separation of powers. For decades, the executive branch has been gaining more control over how the US interacts with the world economy. This ruling acts as a reset button. It reminds the government that while the president leads the military and handles foreign deals, the power of the purse, the power to tax and spend, remains with the representatives of the people. When we look at the global stage, this separation of powers is what makes the American system unique, but also sometimes difficult for other countries to understand. In many nations, the top leader can make trade changes with one order. In the US, the Supreme Court has just reminded everyone that the president is not the final authority on money. This adds a layer of safety for the economy because it prevents one person from making massive changes overnight without a debate. After the February 20 ruling, the government had to find a new way to keep its trade rules in place. They couldn't just let the tariffs disappear because the entire economic plan was built on them. To keep the taxes from vanishing overnight, they used a different law called Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. This allowed them to implement a 10% tax, with the president pushing to raise it to the legal cap of 15%. President Trump reacted to the court's decision with strong criticism. In public statements, he called the ruling ridiculous and poorly written. He described the move as extraordinarily anti American and expressed deep frustration with his own appointees on the court. He suggested that their vote was a sign of disloyalty to the Constitution as he sees it. Despite this public anger, the executive branch acted quickly to pivot to these new legal authorities. They are trying to keep the trade strategy alive, even if the legal foundation has shifted beneath them. This brings us to the 150-day clock. Section 122 is only temporary. It has a strict 150-day limit by law. This means that on July 24th, 2026, these new taxes will stop automatically unless Congress votes to keep them going. This creates a deadline that moves the focus from the White House to Congress. For the first time in a year, the members of the House and the Senate will have to go on the record and vote for or against these tariffs. This is a high stakes moment for American politics. At the same time, the U.S. Trade Office, led by Ambassador Jameson Greer, has started new investigations under a rule called Section 301. This shows a change in how the U.S. applies pressure. Instead of fast, global taxes, the government is now using slower, more specific targets. They are looking into things like industrial overcapacity, which means countries making more goods than they can sell, and unfair pricing in medicines. The president has stated that these alternative laws will eventually help tariffs replace much of the modern income tax system. This is a very big goal, and it would change how every American pays for the government. But for now, the president still has tools, even if they are more limited. He must now show formal proof for every move he makes, and he must watch the calendar as the July deadline approaches. This middle period is very important. Between now and July 24th, we will likely see a lot of arguing and political deals in Washington. Lobbyists for big companies, farm groups, and technology firms will all be trying to influence how Congress votes. The president's power is now on a timer, and every trade choice will now be open to public debate and court reviews. If Congress decides not to extend the tariffs, it could lead to a massive drop in government revenue, which might force the government to rethink its entire budget. On the other hand, if they do extend them, it would mean that the high tariff era has the full support of the American people's representatives, making it much harder for other countries to challenge in international courts. The impact of this ruling is very clear in the father of all deals between the US and India. Signed on February 2nd, this deal was one of the biggest achievements of the current trade strategy. It was based on the idea of high taxes. Under this deal, the US lowered tariffs on Indian goods from 25% to 18%. In return, the White House claimed India committed to a staggering $500 billion in investments and agreed to halt Russian oil purchases. Though New Delhi has maintained that its shift away from Russian energy is simply based on market pricing. Because the Supreme Court ended the high emergency taxes, the baseline for this deal has changed. Under the new 10 to 15% tax from Section 122, Indian businesses are actually paying less than what they agreed to in the deal. This has put one of the world's most important trade agreements in a confusing spot. While it helps Indian sellers for now, it makes it harder for the US to make sure India follows through on its side of the deal. For example, if the tax is already lower than 18%, India might not feel the same pressure to stop buying Russian oil as quickly as the White House anticipated. The deal was built on the threat of the IEEPA 25% oil penalty. Without that threat, the US has lost its immediate leverage. Now the US must rely on Section 301 investigations, which take a long time and require a lot of paperwork. This gives India more room to negotiate and potentially slow down their shift away from Russian energy. For the rest of the world, this ruling is a sign that US trade policy is no longer just up to the president. Trading partners in Europe, Asia, and South America are now realizing that they have to deal with Congress, not just the White House. While taxes against some competitors, like China, are still in place under different laws, the era of sudden, global emergency taxes is over. For friends and rivals of the US, trade has become more complicated. Making a deal with the president is no longer a guarantee that the law will stay the same. Every agreement now has to be checked against the strength of the US Constitution and the mood of the US Congress. This change also affects how companies plan for the future. If you're a business owner in India or a car maker in Germany, you now have to worry about what happens on July 24th. Will Congress extend the taxes? Will they lower them? Or will they let them expire? This uncertainty is the new normal for global trade. Countries that once focused only on the White House are now hiring more lobbyists and diplomats to talk to members of Congress, because that is where the real power over money now sits. There is another side to the story that involves a lot of money. While the ruling makes the future clearer, it creates a huge mess regarding the past. Since the start of 2025, the government has collected about $175 billion in taxes under the law that has now been struck down. The Supreme Court did not tell the government to give this money back immediately. Instead, they sent the fight to a special trade court. This means that while the emergency era is over, a long period of legal battles has begun. Companies that paid these taxes are now lining up to ask for their money back. But the government might argue that the money has already been spent, or that the process for giving it back should be slow. This could take years to finish. For the global market, this means things are still uncertain. The risk is no longer a sudden order from the president, but a long web of court cases. This backup of cases could slow down the trade courts for a long time and create a lot of work for lawyers, but not necessarily for the workers making the goods. These legal fights will be about billions of dollars, and the outcome will decide which companies stay in business and which ones fail. The ruling in Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump is a fix that brings back the balance of power in the American government. The shortcut for trade policy has been closed, and the clock is now ticking toward July 24th. The future of global trade now depends on whether Congress is ready to use the power it has taken back. Will they support the president's vision, or will they try to return to the older, more open rules of trade? Subscribe to Elephanta Insights for ongoing geopolitical analysis and join us for our next briefing as we continue to track these major shifts in global power.